I think the easiest way to explain intermittent fasting is you're eating less often. That's really as simplistic as it is. You're not starving yourself. It's a very important distinction. I remind people that when people are new at fasting, they may have much different fasting and feeding windows than an experienced faster. And so I think a good litmus test is to aim for a 16-8, meaning you go from a period of time, maybe you don't eat from the time you finish dinner at 6 o'clock at night until you eat breakfast the following day at 8 a.m. And you've already got 14 hours fasted.
Cynthia, oh my goodness, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to joining you.
Well, I'm super excited. One, just to have you on, and because I enjoy talking to you every time we do. And two, because I honestly cannot wait for the world to get your book. So let's do this. Let's talk about a super hot topic known as intermittent fasting, especially as it relates to women.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a topic that is obviously near and dear to my heart, but one that I feel like across social media, there's so much fear mongering. I don't know if it's just completely timely, but it almost makes me a little angry and upset. So I'm glad that we're having this conversation to kind of set the record straight about how women fast and why fasting is a good idea for most women and how to do it safely, as opposed to, leaning into that negative kind of bias that I've been seeing quite a bit of.
And we're definitely going to talk about that. That is one of my questions. And I have been telling a number of our practitioner friends, or my practitioner friends, I said, Cynthia Thurlow has a book coming out on intermittent fasting. And they're like, oh, thank goodness. I need a resource that I can just hand my patients and say, just read this. This is what you need to understand. So before we get started, why don't you tell people who you are, your background, what you stand for, so you know who we're talking to.
Yeah, well, it's kind of a long journey. I've been a nurse practitioner for more than 20 years, and my background started in ER medicine. So I'm a bit of an adrenaline junkie. And then, heading into cardiology was just a natural extension of the desire to take care of medically complex patients. And I loved doing that for a long time. And then I became a parent. And when I had my oldest son, which is hard to believe, he'll be 17 in August. When he was 4 months old, he had horrible eczema. And, he was being exclusively breastfed. And I kept asking the pediatrician, is it something I'm eating? Because it made sense to me. Like, maybe it's something I'm eating that's irritating his skin. And I was like, no, he's fine. Sent me home with some steroids. And after it was many, many months of this, I finally said, I want to see the allergist because I want to make sure I'm not giving him something that's making him, making his eczema worse. And so I was as surprised as the next person to find that my son had life-threatening food allergies. And I was sent home with the instructions of pray and carry an EpiPen. And that started my journey into looking more carefully and thoughtfully at the processed food industry, nutrition, and obviously in hospital-based cardiology, we're not really worried about food. And maybe in the clinic, we were talking to our patients about the interrelationship. But certainly back then, that's when we were telling our patients that saturated fat was bad and that fats were evil. And here, take this bromelain brown or this smart balance, or, work on those heart healthy grains. And I can't think of worse nutritional advice to give a patient, especially one who has established cardiovascular disease and very likely is diabetic. And so fast forward a few more years, I had another child and I started getting kind of listless. I love the challenges of cardiology and obviously loved being a nurse practitioner, but I just felt like I was meant to do something else. So initially I started a doctoral program, which I hated. And then I did a wellness coaching program, which was kind of like, meh. And then I read 2 books. I read a book called The Unhealthy Truth by Robin O'Brien, and then later read a book called Eat the Yolks. And I don't even remember the lovely author's name, but I reached out to her and said, your book is completely contrary to everything I ever learned about nutrition, but it is so aligned with what I think is correct that I'd love to know where you got your training. And so off I went to do a functional nutrition program. And that was kind of the beginning of the end of working in traditional allopathic medicine for me personally. And I woke up one day, probably a few years later, and at that point I was in perimenopause, but hadn't realized it. I was doing everything wrong. I was too intense exercise, too restrictive of a diet, lots of stress. Remember the cardiology job, husband who traveled, kids were really young, and no one had ever prepared me for what this was, not my GYN, not my girlfriends, not my mom, no one. And so I hit the wall. And then I started to really think very thoughtfully about, is this type of lifestyle what I want? I'm dealing super high stress job. I'm exhausted. I can't sleep. I'm gaining weight. I'm frustrated. And so from there, in my typical, like I'm very analytical. And so from my perspective, I was like, what do I need to do differently? And so that kind of led me to the idea of intermittent fasting. I read Jason Fung's book. I then had the courage to say, okay, if this is a physician who obviously has done his research and is obviously incredibly knowledgeable, this sounds like a good idea for me. And so I started fasting. And within a week, I felt so much better, so much more mentally clear, that it started to kind of, I use the term bleed, but it really led to discussions I had with patients. And by that point, I was kind of had this side gig working on. And then eventually I got to a point where I couldn't write another prescription. And so I left clinical cardiology without a business plan. I don't recommend that. No business
Talk about
plan.
Stress.
Yeah, exactly. Took a leap of faith. I was like, I'm going to be successful. And my husband was like, what are you talking about? And so I left clinical cardiology on April 1st, 2016. And became an entrepreneur. And so I almost instantaneously started attracting a particular type of woman. It was exactly the woman that I was, someone who felt that their needs were really not being met. They did not have anticipatory guidance about middle age. They certainly weren't told what to expect. And the irony is, around that time, I happened to, first day of my period, I've been telling my GYN, my periods are very heavy. First day of my period, it's my annual exam. And I go in and she goes, oh my gosh, your period is so heavy. And I was like, I told you. And she said, we can fix this. Option number 1, synthetic hormones. Option number 2, an IUD. Option number 3, we'll do an ablation. Or if you don't even want to deal with anything, we'll just do a hysterectomy. And I was like, time out. No.
No.
Exactly. I was like, I think I'm going to say no to all. And she was completely astounded. She's like, why would you want to walk around with, your cycle being that heavy? And I said, there have to be other options. And so it just continued to further validate why we need to be having these conversations with women way before they hit perimenopause. And so I took that leap, and then it really turned into group programs and one-on-one coaching. And then in 2018, I decided as an introvert that I needed to do something that would challenge me further. And I said, okay, I want to do a TED Talk. And my husband's like, what? And I said, I think doing a TED Talk would be a really good, challenging thing for me to do. Because to get up in front of a room of people and execute a talk and have to do it from memory, it sounded kind of scary. And so the rest is history. I did a talk in December of 2018 on perimenopause, was completely embarrassed the entire time, which is why we have to be talking to everyone about middle age, because there should be no shame. There should be no embarrassment. I was completely embarrassed. And then I got off the stage and I was like, that was fantastic. Now I need to talk about it. And then I did a second talk in March of 2019 about intermittent fasting in women. And so that's probably what most people know me for, but that's in a nutshell, over 20 plus years of my work experience and life experience has really gotten me to where I am today, which is really positioning women to feel inspired, empowered, and educated to live their best lives. Because if we listen to conventional wisdom, you're north of 40, you're all washed up, you're irrelevant, you're invisible, you're not important anymore. And I'd be the first person to say, I think we really have to change the narrative so that women understand that every stage of our life can be wonderful. And, it doesn't have to just be under a certain age threshold. It should be throughout our lifetime. We live high quality lives.
Here, I for those who are listening and maybe not watching on video, I'm like nodding my head the whole time. Like, yes, absolutely. And you and I have had multiple conversations about that. As women transition into perimenopause, they, first of all, don't know what it is. It's not very well talked about, although it's that education is gaining traction, thankfully, due to, educators like yourself. But I also love that your whole story is extremely relatable to so many women. So many women are like, I am right there with you. I completely understand. I was reading when I was reading the intro of your book, I was like, oh yeah, a lot of women come to me, write me in the DMs, in the comments, and I'm sure you as well. And they're like, I have no guidance. I was told, welcome to your 40s or welcome to your early 50s. This this is common, right?
Mhm.
So good luck. The best we can do is synthetic hormones,
Mhm.
maybe a hysterectomy if you're really hating life, an antidepressant, and
Yep.
and best of luck. Welcome
Yeah.
to the transition.
Yeah.
And like I said, you and I've talked about that. That's crap. So I can't wait to dig in here. So that we're all on the same plane, can you explain what is intermittent fasting? What is intermittent fasting? Because I had a conversation with somebody the other day who was arguing with me, and I said, "Oh, you're confusing restricted eating, so calorie restriction with intermittent fasting." And then, of course, there's longer fasting and
Mhm.
shorter fasting. So can you sort of go through these so everybody knows what these terms actually mean?
Yeah, no, and it's a great question. I think the easiest way to explain intermittent fasting is you're eating less often. That's really as simplistic as it is. You're not starving yourself. It's a very important distinction. I remind people that when people are new at fasting, they may have much different fasting and feeding windows than an experienced faster. And so I think a good litmus test is to aim for a 16-8, meaning you go from a period of time, maybe you don't eat from the time you finish dinner at 6 o'clock at night until you eat breakfast the following day at 8 a.m. And you've already got 14 hours fasted. So really, in essence, a lot of time of when you're sleeping is incorporated into that fasting window. So it's not nearly as terrifying as it sounds. And so I teach people to kind of continue to open up that window. And the benefits with fasting are really highly dependent on the amount of time spent not eating. And this is important. So, sometimes people get very granular and they want to get very nuanced. And so I say, listen, if someone's new to fasting, they're a standard American diet and they're a couch potato, 12 hours of not eating is probably an overwhelming amount of time because we've conditioned our patients to eat to quote unquote stoke our metabolism, and that breakfast is the most important meal of the day. And so people have grown up with that kind of mindset, and it's very hard. We talk about cognitive dissonance. This applies to a lot of things these days, but it also applies to this nutritional dogma. And so when I'm initially talking to someone, we just say, okay, digestive rest. We're going to not eat from 6 o'clock at night till 6 o'clock in the morning. And for a lot of people, that's very overwhelming to do. There was a great study that came out last year from Sachin Panda's group talking about meal frequency. And they had an app in the phone, so it made it very easy for people to participate. And we start looking at the average person, how frequently they're consuming food or drinking sugary beverages, anywhere from 6 to 10 times a day. And that's like the average person. So there are many people doing much more than that. But back to your original question, we're talking about different opportunities in which to fast. There's like beginning, I always say, put the training wheels on. So there's beginning fasting, and then you can slowly have, you can play around with those fasting windows. Might be 16 hours, 18 hours, 20. There's OMAD, which is 1 meal a day. There are 24-hour fasts, 30-hour fasts, 3 to 5 day fasts. But ultimately, it's really determined by what are your goals. Because for some people, they want to just have digestive rest, and that's great. And there are certain times, for example, in a woman's cycle where she should not do more than 12 or 13 hours without eating. And that's an important distinction to make. So there's still benefits depending on how long you are fasting. But a good rule of thumb is to aim for a 16-hour fast, because we know that that's a point at which we get a lot of upregulation in specific processes that go on in the body. It's a good benchmark to start from. But much like anything, we don't do the same exercise every day. We don't eat the same foods every day. Once you are fat adapted, once you're at a point where your body is able to be more metabolically flexible, then you can play around with those fasting windows. And I think that's when things really get very exciting.
Yeah.
But a big differentiator between fasting and caloric restriction is it's not about calories. That's one of the greatest misnomers. And I feel very strongly there's a lot of people who believe in the hormone hypothesis as it pertains to weight gain versus calorie restriction. I am very much on the hormone camp, as I know you are as well, that the reason why we either can or cannot lose weight largely is mitigated by hormonal imbalances versus caloric restriction, because our bodies are far more sophisticated than we are giving them credit for. If we think it's just about a unit of calorie of measurement, which is all that a calorie is. And it's not to suggest that calories are per se not important,
Sure.
but it is not the benchmark for which we should utilize as the bigger distinction. And so I think that fasting is eating less often. That's really the best way to think about it. I find the word fasting sometimes can be triggering. So if I see, let's just eat less often, people go, okay, I can do that.
Yeah. Well, especially in that study, which is really shocking to me, is that people don't realize those quick bites, finishing the little half of your child's sandwich, having that couple sips of kombucha, like having, a handful of crackers as you walk through the kitchen. If you've got chocolate sitting on your desk, on top of, if you do breakfast, lunch, and dinner, it's all of, you may think, oh, I don't eat that often. I have a breakfast, I have a lunch, I have a dinner. And then you forget, like, oh, right, but I do eat that like half a smoothie, but I divide it up, and I absolutely have that coffee drink that I sip on over the course of 4 hours. And I absolutely finish off my kid's plate. And it's the little things over time that's constantly affecting, well, everything, digestion, glucose, insulin, a lot of things. And so I love that you say that. So before we go further, though, I do want to sort of understand, like, who shouldn't do intermittent fasting. So before we get into like the benefits, and, we're going to talk about the women's cycle, and we're going to talk about all these, myths that come with intermittent fasting. Who do you think shouldn't consider intermittent fasting? Who's a bad candidate?
Well, first and foremost, if you have a disordered relationship with food, so binge eating, anorexia, bulimia, unless, here's my caveat, because I have angry DMs that come after me about this, unless you are working with a fully qualified eating disorder specialist and they have decided with you that you are in a position to be able to participate with intermittent fasting and not trigger your eating disorder, I think that as a rule, those individuals should really avoid fasting. I think anyone that's just been hospitalized, that's underweight, someone who's just been chronically, when I say chronically ill, someone who's unstable, maybe you're getting medications regulated very frequently. Maybe you're a brittle diabetic, or you're, at a point where you have significant chronic health issues. Digestive rest is probably reasonable. Beyond that, you don't want to put additional stress on the body. I think about children. I get a lot of questions about children and teenagers. And I'm like, if you're still growing, please don't restrict the macronutrients you're, providing your child with. And I think there's so many different strategies to use with obese, overweight children and teens. It could be, changing their macronutrient profile without restricting the time frame in which they eat. And then lastly, I would say I'm not a fan of fasting for breastfeeding or pregnant women. There's a lot of good research to support this. I do see quite a few people on social media that, proudly talk about fasting throughout a pregnancy or fasting while they're breastfeeding. This is really the time you're either growing a human or you're feeding a human. And I can't think of a time when you should be restricting your food intake that could adversely impact said growing or feeding human.
Right.
And so I think it's one of the few times that women get a little bit of a break in terms of, I always say, like, when I was breastfeeding, I could eat like a truck driver, or I could eat like a quarterback or a football person. And so I actually marveled at how much food I could consume and create breast milk. And so for me, the thought of restricting the time frame in which I ate would have just been so foreign to me. So those are the big ones. Obviously, there are a lot of nuances, but those are things specific to women that I usually say these are things I want to be really careful about. And I'm very honest. I talk about how I have a 14-year-old who is a competitive swimmer and does not like to eat breakfast, and I don't force him to. But when he eats, the kid eats 2 big lunches, 2 big dinners. And I was having a conversation with the pediatrician. I was like, he crams an entire day's worth of meals into like an 8-hour compressed window. And I said, he's flourishing, he's doing well, but as a rule, I don't recommend fasting for teenagers. And so, we could talk secondarily about, just how some people naturally just are not hungry in the morning. And I think you should, really lean into that. You shouldn't feel obligated to eat when you're not hungry.
And I also love that you put the caveat on there too, that unless you're working with somebody who really understands this and feels that you both have come to the decision intermittent fasting is good for you. Because I find what happens is, people hear about it, they read about it, they do a little bit of research, and then they decide they're going to try it or jump in without fully understanding all the different facets. Or if somebody is breastfeeding and they're like, oh my gosh, I'm one of the women who hasn't lost weight breastfeeding. I'm going to start intermittent fasting. It doesn't mean necessarily that you can't or shouldn't, but if you have no idea what you're doing, like, please seek out somebody who at least can help guide you through if it's the right thing for you. And the same with, I love that you say that. You and I've had lots of conversations around disordered eating, given, histories. And so I think that is really important because, again, I've seen it in your comments. I've seen it in my comments where people are angry or they push back. And I'm like, wait, hold on. First of all, it's social media. Second of all, work with somebody, decide if it is the right thing for you. As a general rule, these are the reasons it's not recommended, but it doesn't mean it's set in stone. And don't just decide, willy-nilly with no education about it. You're just going to jump in and try it.
Well, and I think it's, ultimately, I know we come from the same place. We want women to be successful. And I sometimes will find if I'm teaching in a group program and someone's messaging my team and asking for guidance, I can almost tell the people that have got those tendencies towards leaning towards an eating disorder because they're, it's enough for me to I then add, the next question is, have you ever, been diagnosed or treated for X? And I've had some instances where I've just really recommended that people not fast. I'm like, I don't want to just take your money. That's not what this is about. This is really about teaching and educating you, but I don't think you're healed enough to be able to properly participate. And I want you to be successful in whatever it is that you decide to do. But I don't think this is the right program.
Right. No, I agree. And I love that. So on the flip side, what are the benefits? Why do we do intermittent fasting?
Well, I think a lot of people, exactly. Well, I think a lot of women come to intermittent fasting out of curiosity. They want to change body composition. They want to lose weight. But really, the really cool things about fasting are beneath the surface. So we know that we tap into this process called autophagy. It's this waste and recycling process of the body. So we get rid of diseased mitochondria and organelles and proteins that are misfolded. Our body is able to literally take out the trash. So that's number one. And I think given the past 2 years, we need all the help we can get in terms of getting rid of things we don't need. Number two, I think about the improvements in biophysical markers. And so it could be blood pressure. It can be fasting insulin, fasting glucose, triglycerides, HDL, uric acid. I mean, all these biophysical markers that are so instrumental in metabolic health. That we've seen significant improvements. I think about the fact that the mental clarity piece, which is a direct reflection of lowered insulin levels and the facilitation of breakdown of fatty acids with diffusion across the blood-brain barrier. And, this particular type of ketone, beta hydroxybutyrate, loves the brain. And so our brains, which is surprising, people assume our brains love sugar. Our brains actually love fat as a fuel source. So you get tremendous mental clarity. I think about just the reduction in neurodegenerative diseases, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's. A lot of women probably already know that we are largely protected from a lot of cognitive disorders until we go into menopause. And I think on a lot of levels, when we talk about insulin sensitivity and estrogen and think about the byproduct of how that impacts the brain, knowing that we're going to have greater insulin sensitivity if we're fasting and how important that is for brain health. Also reductions in specific types of cancers. I know for a lot of people, this is the thing that gets them motivated. And a reduction in inflammation and oxidative stress. I have so many people that have said that, their joints stopped aching, they slept better. And they always say, like, it started with the weight loss and that was all awesome, but then I felt so good, and then insert whatever it is that they found. But those are for me, the bigger benefits that I generally find women, once they start the process of fasting and they start feeling so much better, it just further reinforces the good behavior, meaning that they continue to feel the benefits,
right,
even beyond just the physical benefits. I always say the non-scale victories are super important, but like, what are some of the other things that improve for you? The other thing that I forgot to mention was that for a lot of women, they have hot flashes that get a whole lot better. And ladies, you can get hot flashes in perimenopause and menopause. It's not like they're just for menopausal women, largely because of the byproduct of improvement in blood sugar regulation. And so that for me is huge. In fact, this last group that just went through one of my group programs, that was the resounding comments when we were like, I didn't know I could be in menopause or perimenopause and not have hot flashes. And I didn't realize it was all tied up in how frequently I was eating. So I think that's another huge win, because we know like vasomotor symptoms, hot flashes can be tremendously debilitating for women.
Yeah. Yeah. And as I was talking to an interventional cardiologist, Dr. Saltiel, she was saying how those vasomotor symptoms, especially as we get older, give us an increased risk for heart disease.
No good.
Which is no good. Yeah. Which you also know. And so does it matter, all those benefits? Does it matter if you are a 12-hour intermittent faster, 14, 16, the longer you do, do like boxes get checked as you go?
Well, like autophagy is a good one. You know, a lot of people get fixated on longer is better. So yes, we know you get up regulation in autophagy the longer you fast. But we know, based on study research, 16 hours seems to be the sweet spot. But I always encourage people, like, I don't want you to suffer to get to 16 hours. Just say, okay, now I have autophagy. I think it's much like mTOR. They're kind of balance each other out throughout, our day. And so I think it's important for people to understand, like, if you want more digestive rest, if you want stem cell activation, if you want some of those longevity, telomere activation or improvement, you have to fast longer, but you don't start there. So it's always with the context of, are you doing a longer fast to plateau bust? Are you doing a longer fast because you want to impact longevity? Are you doing a longer fast because you want some stem cell activation? Like being very clear about what you want. Because I think some people just think longer is better, fasting longer is better, and anything less than that is not good. And I remind people that our bodies are so sophisticated. They desire, much like, you have a dog, I have dogs. My dogs like to be challenged. Intellectually, they like to be challenged. Our bodies like to be challenged. That hormesis, the whole hormetic stress. And I remind people that it's the right amount of stress in the right amount at the right time, and how our bodies are the same way. So it might be that maybe you do one longer fast a week, or maybe you do it once a month, or if you're still in peak fertile years, you might do them less frequently because your body is just exquisitely more attuned to macronutrient changes much more so than a menopausal woman. Right. And so I think that I love the distinction, because a lot of people, they get very granular. They're like, tell me exactly when autophagy kicks in. And I always say, like, longer is better, but 16 to 18 hours is probably a good point to leverage. Obviously, when people get sick, as an example, like someone was messaging me today, they must have like a virus, upper respiratory infection. And like, I don't feel like eating. I said, then listen to your body. If you don't feel like eating, just stay hydrated, have some electrolytes, rest. That's what your body's asking for. And it's because your body is innately trying to upregulate, get rid of, take out the garbage, upregulate autophagy so that you can get better faster.
I get asked one about intermittent fasting. For me personally, they're like, do you do intermittent fasting? And I always say, often yes, but I also listen to my body first. So if I happen to wake up hungry, I eat. I don't, I'm not like, oh no, I have to get to 16 hours so that my autophagy can kick in. I can take out the trash. If I wake up hungry, it's in everybody's best interest if I eat.
But it's important.
Yeah.
It's so important. I think, yesterday I did like an Insta story, and I was saying, I've been lifting more, and I woke up, I was really hungry when I woke up, and I went to the gym, and I came home and I was like, it's 9:00 in the morning. I'm going to break my fast. And so I did an Insta story, and I got all these DMs like, you break your fast that early? I was like, I was hungry.
Yeah.
I had lifted. I decided that I didn't need to go 17, 18 hours. I'm going to go 15 hours, 14 hours, whatever it was. I don't even know how many hours I fasted, but the point is, it's meant to be flexible. And I think it's this very reductionistic thinking that we have to be rigid, and we have to be like, we have to do it the same way every day. And I remind people, once you have learned the basics, then you can experiment. And I'm glad that you listen to your body as well. And we shouldn't have to apologize for it either. Like, some people feel like they have to announce it to the world. Today, I was not able to fast. And I'm like, okay, where are you in your cycle? That's the other thing. Like, where are you in your cycle? Because if it's 2 days before your period, well, you might not have the ability to go 18 hours, nor should you push your body that hard.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Sleep, stress, how late did you stay up the night? But all those things affect how you do the next day. And like I said, if you wake up hungry, it might be in your best interest, or those around you, not to be hangry, and to, just hit the reset button and start over the next day.
Exactly.
I get this question a lot. It's also in your book. Does intermittent fasting, quote, put you into starvation mode?
No. And I think there's an important distinction. Fasting is choosing to eat within a specific time frame. Starvation is choosing not to eat. That's a very, very important distinction. The other thing is when you're in a non-fed state, your body's upregulating all these, compensatory mechanisms. So I remind people that, the autophagy piece, growth hormone, all these things that happen, norepinephrine, I mean, all these neurochemicals in the body that are designed to, once you've been fat, once you're metabolically flexible, designed to ensure that you're not like hungry all the time, that you're not, it's not that you're suppressing the cues, that your body's just gotten more efficient with saying, hey, there's no food in my stomach. So that means I have to tap into some fat stores. Okay, I'm going to free up those, fatty acids and ketones. I'm going to, give myself some glycogen. I'm doing really good. Like I'm good right now.
Yeah. As
opposed to starvation, which is choosing not to eat, period. That is a choice. Is very, very different. And I think that on a lot of levels, and I had to actually do a rebuttal the other day to an article that came out where there was a registered dietitian who was saying that, people that intermittent fast, they're dysregulating their blood sugar and they're going to get sick. And I mean, all this fear mongering stuff. And so I thought to myself, I think if we explained to people that when your body is efficient at using fuel, you don't have to eat frequently. When your body is efficient in using fuel, it is able to have sustained energy. You're not going to have an energy slump. You're going to be able to lose weight more easily. You're not going to be hangry. And so I think that's such an important distinction, as opposed to, saying starvation, which of course you're going to be miserable because you're choosing fully to not participate in eating, hopefully for a good reason, if it's just experimentation.
Right.
But I think that's an important distinction to make. And the other thing that happens, and I've been very transparent about this, 3 years ago, I was in the hospital. I lost 15 pounds in a week because my body was catabolizing my muscle. It was going in like Pac-Man and, breaking my muscle down to use as fuel because I was not able to eat because I was so sick. And so I remind people like that's starvation because I was sick. And what your body does under that threat or that level of illness is it goes in and it'll actually break down body parts, in my case, muscle. Yeah. It'll break it down. So you'll have a fuel source. And that is such a different kind of methodology and thought process. So I'm glad that you asked that question, because it's one that I think is really important for people to understand that there's definitely a distinction.
And you see it on social media. And actually my next question is around muscle, because the other two big things that I see myth busting wise are, well, I don't intermittent fast because I don't want to muscle waste. And I don't intermittent fast because I'm afraid it's going to slow down my thyroid. I see those two in the average person, not a hospitalized person, right, as in your case, but in an average person, well enough to comment in the DMs.
If they're on Instagram, they're obviously
probably not in the hospital, very ill. Yes.
Well, I mean, there's a couple things. Muscle protein synthesis is largely mitigated by high quality animal-based protein consumption and adequate stimulus. So lifting heavy weights. And then along with that is high quality sleep. And so I remind people that kind of the old methodology, you've got to eat immediately before and after exercise. And no, your body takes into account all the food you've eaten within a 24-hour period of time. And so I think it's important for people to understand you can build muscle and fast. However, here's the caveat: you have to hit your protein macros. You got to lift heavy enough weights and you got to sleep. And you have to fast for your cycle. I think that's an important distinction. I certainly have been able to build muscle while fasted. So I think when people are getting enough animal-based protein, and most women are not. So I say, I think the average woman's probably doing 50 or 60 grams a day, which is not nearly enough. You really need to be pushing 100 grams a day or more. The other piece is, you get peaks of growth hormone in a fasted state, especially at night. So that's why the high quality sleep is so important. We get that first peak of growth hormone, I believe around 1 a.m., if memory serves me correctly. And then the other piece, I think that, there's so much that goes into thyroid function. Yeah. And I think for a lot of people, if you're overdoing anything, overdoing the exercise, over restricting food intake, not eating often enough, not sleeping, any stressor is going to stress that thyroid gland. And I don't think you can shake a finger and say, oh, it's definitely because of fasting. I find that a lot of people who have thrashed thyroids are the same people who overdo everything else. Like they're extremists, and it's not a criticism. It's just an observation. They're extremists. They, if a little bit of exercise is good, then they have to do a lot of exercise. And, same thing with if a little bit of not eating a lot of carbs is good, then no carbs is better. And so it's that kind of reductionistic thinking that in many ways, I think gets people into trouble. I mean, for full transparency, I've had a thyroid issue probably since perimenopause started, and I've been able to successfully continue to fast, but I also know myself and know that I know what my body will tell me when I'm overdoing it. Like you can get more tired. Like, how's your energy? How's your sleep? How do you feel after you exercise? I mean, I think we have to, and I know you do a great job of this, we have to continue to teach women that we need to check in with ourselves. And it's all those lifestyle pieces. Like if your hair is falling out and you sleep terribly and, you're not feeling well, and you're significantly acutely hypothyroid or, at the extremes, then it's probably not a beneficial stressor to add to your stress bucket. However, if you're sleeping well, you're, leaning into the right types of exercise, you've got a nutrient dense whole foods diet without restriction, then fasting might be a good idea for you. Yeah. But it's always with the context of checking in with yourself and really leaning into what is your body telling you? I mean, these are not the things I was taught as an NP student years ago, but I've just learned over time, what are the markers? What are the objective things that you can say to yourself? Like, what's my energy like? Did I sleep well? I mean, super simple stuff. You don't have to have an internal dialogue with yourself. You can just kind of say, I get up in the morning, or if you really want to biohack it, look at your Oura ring. Like I love that my Oura ring always correlates with my sleep quality. So if I get up in the morning, good example, I did hot yoga last night for an hour. I don't recommend doing that before bed, but it was just an experiment. And even though I felt good when I got up, my resting heart rate was up all night, which it normally is not. And I said, oh, I hadn't fully recovered, even though I drank 40 ounces of water with electrolytes. I did all the right things. And I said to my husband, okay, the experiment is done. I don't need to do 7:15 a.m. or 7:15 p.m. hot yoga. That was not a good idea. I need to do it earlier in the day, but just kind of checking in with yourself. And today I didn't go to the gym because my Oura ring was barking at me and saying, your sleep quality was in the toilet because your resting heart rate was up. So I think you can absolutely fast with thyroid issues, provided that your thyroid medication is stable, provided that you're checking in with yourself. I think it does women a disservice to suggest that fasting is harmful, because it's really all an N of one. Like each one of us are individuals. And so there are some people that don't do well with fasting, who have thyroid problems. There are plenty of people who do just fine with fasting that have thyroid problems. It really depends on the individual.
Which is why we love individualized, personalized medicine as best that we can, right? And I know that this isn't a scientific study, but I do appreciate in the comments of social media when women stand up and say that, right? If somebody says, I don't intermittent fast, or whatever it is, but we're talking about intermittent fast. I don't do that because I have a thyroid problem. And then under it, the sub comments, the replies oftentimes are several who say, well, I have a thyroid problem and I love intermittent fasting. It's made a world of difference for me. And it just goes to show that individualization. So the person who maybe says, I don't do it, maybe they shouldn't do it. Maybe they, just like you said, maybe if they checked in with themselves and they just feel inherently like, God, I could never do that. That would set me over the edge. Yeah. Good. Don't do it then. And then the commenters who say, well, I actually do intermittent fasting with hypothyroid. I feel great. I'm doing great. I've done it a year, 2 years, whatever. Good for them too, right? I'm clapping both of them. I'm like, fantastic. If you know that about yourself, then hallelujah. But I love, it's like not one size fits all. It is, right? We have to take into account. But I do want to comment about the protein part, because I am guilty. I was guilty of the not enough protein, and I didn't know it. I thought I was eating plenty of protein. I do eat animal. I know that's going to upset a lot of the vegans and vegetarians. I fully understand. And with all due respect to them, it just works for me. And listening to you over time, being just like a tiny smidge bit older than me, and then listening to Dr. Stacy Sims, who wrote the book Roar, Women Are Not Small Men. And she's also a smidge older than me. And she said, you need to get your protein up as you head into perimenopause. As you hit your 40s, you're not getting enough protein. And you both explain why. Yeah. And I thought, fine, okay, I will add in more animal-based protein. And OMG, let me tell you, it made me feel so much better.
Yeah. Isn't it amazing?
My musculature was better. My energy was better. My strength was better. I felt less puffy. I didn't realize I was puffy until I for some reason, added in more, protein. And I do recognize that now, I'll be 45 in June. And well, since this podcast will be around for a while, I'll be 45 in June of 2022, just in case someone's listening way later. And so once I added in a lot more protein over the last, I don't know, 4 or 5 months, and that, you're right, you are spot on. That's made a world of difference for me.
Yeah.
Anyhow.
Well, and I think for a lot of women, we've been conditioned to believe, the heart healthy grains and all these other things. And I just think as women get older, perimenopause, menopause, we start to lose some insulin sensitivity, we lose some musculature, we develop some sarcopenia. It's not a matter of if, but when.
Yeah.
And so, if we really think about what muscles are, their currency, their currency for our health. And so I remind people all the time, as we're losing muscle, we are losing insulin sensitivity. And think of muscles as glucose reservoirs. I mean, I have a girlfriend right now who's just diagnosed with diabetes, and she was so mad that I suggested she start doing some body weight exercises. She's like, I hate it. I absolutely hate it. And I said, well, think about what we need to be doing. We need to, we need to build some muscle. We need to, reinforce that insulin sensitivity piece. And I think that's so critically important. And I just think the satiety from protein is unlike anything else you'll get. And so on a lot of levels, that shuts people's appetite off. It's like, okay, I'm full, I'm done. I don't want to go look for cookies or candy or anything else, salty chips. I'm just done. I feel really satiated. And I think that's a really empowering feeling.
Right. And it does, I found, I don't know how you, with your patients, but it's not overnight. It's not like I added in more animal protein on a Monday and by Tuesday I was not craving chocolate. Like, that did not happen. But it was over time that it was very helpful.
Absolutely. And I think it's, if you're doing 60 now, do 65. If you're doing, 70, do 75. So really aiming, I think I pigeonholed Dr. Gabrielle Line and said, okay, what's the least, what should everyone be aiming for? And so she said 100 grams. So I used to say aiming for 100 grams, you really want to just keep pushing that lever up. Because I'm sure, during your training, just like I did, I can't tell you how many 50-plus-year-olds, I mean, you don't even have to be that old, who had lost muscle mass in their legs. They could barely get off the commode. And I thought to myself, heck, I don't want to be that person.
Right.
So it's the loss of muscle mass can really impact your activities of daily living. And so obviously we don't want any of your listeners to go through that. So definitely know that protein intake is critically important for us.
And then how do you adjust intermittent fasting for those of us who are still cycling? Does it, in their follicular phase, ovulation, luteal phase, do you change it at all?
I do. I think in the follicular phase, when estradiol's predominating, and I'm oversimplifying, and I'm sure your guests get the, day by day breakdown of how things go. But in a traditional 28-day cycle, I like women to push the fasting lever in the first 2 weeks when estrogen is predominant. Then ovulation, things you can continue with what you're doing. But as you head into that luteal phase and progesterone is predominating, and especially the last 5 to 7 days, I really recommend that women adjust their fasting so that they're maybe doing 12 or 13 hours, which I think of more as digestive rest. It's also a time you can integrate about 150 calories worth of extra carbohydrate, but not the crappy kind, not the cookies and pastries and things like that. But, maybe you're having
when you crave it most.
Right. Exactly. Just kind of leaning into what your body is telling you. But I think when women are still fasting, there's definitely the distinction. If you're under 35 and you're lean, you should not be fasting regularly. You just don't have the added bandwidth. Now, the average woman under 35, yes, you can fast the first 2 weeks of your cycle, should be able to do that. You can also push the envelope with exercise and things like that. Perimenopause is a different time frame because we're having these loss of progesterone and generally this estrogen dominant state, which can mitigate a lot of symptoms that people experience. And so it goes back to those lifestyle things. What's your sleep like? What's your stress management? Are you over exercising? Are you consuming anti-inflammatory nutrition? And ladies, I hate to say this, there's a lot of fun foods that are full of inflammatory ingredients. And so gluten and dairy are two big ones. Alcohol is another one. I remind people that alcohol is processed as a toxin first. And secondarily, we know it suppresses melatonin, increases cortisol. So maybe you fall asleep, but you're not going to stay asleep. So really looking at those variables and deciding, how well am I taking care of myself? And am I in a position where I can add intermittent fasting as another stress to what's going on? I find for most perimenopausal women who are still getting a menstrual cycle, first 2 weeks, no problems. Luteal phase can be more challenging, especially if they're not, they might be in a position where they could warrant, even transdermal progesterone. But if their sleep is really deteriorates the week before their menstrual cycle, you absolutely positively do not want to be adding that in. These are also usually the women who get offered things like anti-anxiety agents and antidepressants when maybe what they need is a scooch of progesterone and they might be able to sleep better. And then, the 12 months without a menstrual cycle, menopausal women have a lot more flexibility. And I think that's an important distinction to make. I don't ever consider women to be many men by any estimation, but menopausal women and men have a bit less hormonal flux day to day, week to week. And so they get a little bit more flexibility in how they can fast. But I think for most other women, observing that the week before your menstrual cycle, you want to avoid fasting is really important.
And I'm sure you get this question. I get the question of, I'm trying to push it, Carrie. It's, it's PMS week. And I feel like I'm trying to push to get to whatever it is, 15 hours, 16 hours. I'm like, stop pushing. Don't stop stressing yourself out. It's your physiology is completely changed from what it was 2 weeks ago. It's ease out of the intermittent fasting. And then you can ease in when your period comes. That's okay.
And I think it's important for people to understand that if you want to fast successfully as a cycling female, you just understand that, you don't do the same exercise week to week. You don't do the same fasting schedule week to week. And I think when people honor their physiology, it all of a sudden makes things a whole lot easier. Like I wish I know more about the menstrual cycle now than I ever did before. And it makes me so mad. I'm like, why didn't I learn these things in school? My nursing friends and I always talk about that. We're like, how do we know more now? Like, does that make any sense whatsoever? And we're like, no, absolutely not. Having said that, I do think it's important for women to not feel like they have to make excuses for being a female. I think our distinctive physiology is what's beautiful. And we just have to lean into it. Like it's really our superpower if we use it that way.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, before we bring up the book, because I do want to, of course, that book that's launching, I'm so excited. I do kind of want to rapid fire just some of the questions I've gotten about what breaks a fast, we see this a lot on, well, I'll just go through the questions because some I think are pretty funny. So what breaks a fast? Does coffee break a fast?
Well, I think as a rule, no. However, there are people that coffee, whether it's the mold, the mycotoxins, or it just stresses your adrenals, there are people that can get an insulin response. So I think this is highly bio-individual. As a rule, no. I am a fan of people consuming polyphenol-rich compounds in a fasted state. So for the average person, no, but you do need to understand that I believe in a clean fast, which means the only thing that you can really add to coffee that's not going to break your fast are things like, some people, it's very bitter, so they want to add high quality sea salt like Redmond's.
Oh yeah.
Or they can add cinnamon, which helps with insulin sensitivity. Because there's some people who are like, oh my gosh, I can't go from having 5 cups of cream in my coffee and survive. But the answer is, in most instances, no. But I have read some data that some people, because it stresses their adrenals, and this is where bio-individuality really rules, you have to be careful. If you suspect that you are, getting a cortisol rise from the coffee and indirectly a blood sugar response, and then indirectly an insulin response, you could always check with a glucometer, and that might be a helpful way to investigate that.
Or the people who have access to or have been prescribed a continuous glucose monitor, the CGM, I have seen just, one-off data and people anecdotally posting their before and after black coffee or, tea or green tea or whatever it is, to show if it does affect the glucose or if it does not affect the glucose. So if somebody has access to that, that could be a nice little insight into their health.
Yes.
So speaking of 5 cups of creamer, I have read that it's interesting. I'm always like, who, you understand fasting, right? I will see posts that say if it's under 50 calories, it doesn't count. If it's under 100 calories of creamer, it doesn't count.
Those are the fit pros. I welcome those people when I see them eating grapes or nuts or whatever it is that they're eating. I'm like, if I were choosing to break my fast, it would not be with something like a grape.
Right. Oh my
Yeah.
gosh.
If it's caloric, then you are, and especially something that, when I see people, the instances of 100 or 50 or 100 calories, it's like a food item they have to chew and swallow. So to me, if you're having bitter tea or coffee, which is a negligible, if at all, amount of calories, is very different than chewing something, which is going to stimulate the cephalic phase insulin response. And for sure, you're going to break fast. And there's nothing wrong. If you need to break your fast early, by all means, do it. But to sit back and say you haven't broken your fast, I think that's your kind of, it's like, you probably also believe that Santa Claus is real,
What? Right. Well, what about MCT oil, medium chain triglyceride oil? That's another one I see, of course, added to coffee on the regular. And then people say, no, it's fasting.
Well, we know MCT oil is processed differently in the body. And so the research I have read is that, up to like 1 teaspoon will not break a fast. I think that the greater concern I always have is, if you're a standard American diet couch potato and you're like, put the training wheels on because you're really struggling to get to 14 hours fasted, a fatty coffee, if you accept it for what it is probably fine. But if you have 3 teaspoons, and I see lots of guys that can do this, 3 teaspoons of MCT oil in their coffee, I'm like, if you're trying to change body composition, lose weight, this is like not the way to go about doing it. So I think it's always in the context of what are your goals? And, based on my research, like 1 teaspoon of MCT oil, but that's not generally a recommended practice because I like people to fast clean.
Yeah.
Now, if you say to someone like, I'm fasting for like 5 days and putting 1 teaspoon of MCT oil in my coffee is going to allow me to fast longer. I mean, it goes back to what are your goals? What are you looking to do? But I see a lot of people who, when they clean up their dirty fasting, all of a sudden they start getting the results that they want. And so I think that distinction between clean versus dirty fasting is certainly an important one.
And lastly, what about electrolytes?
If they're unsweetened,
which is the big one, right?
Yeah, I think that's an important distinction. And then people say, well, but stevia. And I'm like, I don't know about you. I love me some Element electrolytes, but I don't drink them when I'm in a fasted state because my body's smart enough to know when I put something sugary or sweet on my tongue, my body's going, we're getting fed. Like something's coming, something good is coming. But there are people that want to argue, like, it's like the minutia. I'm like, okay, yes, I know in a lab animal, stevia did not evoke an insulin response. However, my concern is that your body is now still anticipating that something is coming. So unsweetened electrolytes, there's lots of great options that are out there. Element Redmonds, I have one that are really nice for people to try. And I always say, save the sweetened stuff for your fasting window. And I do prefer stevia over a lot of other sweeteners if people are choosing to consume sweetened electrolytes during their feeding window because of the negligible impact on blood sugar, as opposed to some of the artificial aspartame, sucralose, all those junky ones that are out there.
Right. And I very occasionally I have had somebody, mostly again, because of that CGM, that continuous glucose monitor, because it was already on their arm, it was easy for them just to see if what stevia does to them. And not everybody, definitely some people are like, it makes no difference. My blood sugar stays the exact same before and after. And I have had others who go, holy crap, it did bump up, it did go up. However many points that it was enough for them to think it wasn't like 1 or 2 points, but it was enough to be like, damn it.
Yeah.
I guess
bio-individuality.
Yeah, absolutely. So I love that. All right. So moving on, let's talk about your book. Tell us all about your book.
Yeah, it's like hard to believe it's here and coming to fruition. So Intermittent Fasting Transformation is a book about, I think of it as the consummate book written by a woman for women about fasting. And so I talk a little bit about my story and as I always say, trying to encourage people to not do what I was doing so they can save themselves the trouble of crashing into a wall in perimenopause. But I talk a lot about hormones. I know that's an area near and dear to your heart. I talk about the physiology, I talk about the benefits, and then I dive into a 45-day program that I believe is the best program that's out there for women, really honoring our physiology. We spend a whole week, cleaning things up, getting ready, restructuring your macros, because let's be honest, if you've been sugar burning for years and years and years and not efficient or metabolically flexible, it's going to require a little bit of prep work to be successful. And so we talk about restructuring macros, protein, fat, and carbs. We talk about low carb and what that represents. And then we dive into the program, and I teach you all what I consider to be the most important things. It's mindset. It's talking about physiology. It's talking about the who, what, where, when, and why. And then we have a whole week of challenges, which is really exciting, because I'm a big believer that all of us need to be challenged, in one way or another. And so kind of teaching people about different types of fasting, different strategies for fasting, the best practices. Obviously, I am a proponent of clean fasting, because ultimately that will get you the best results, as opposed to the dirty fasting, AKA I'm going to consume 100 calories and it doesn't count. And so the book is really written to be accessible. Although the feedback I've been getting already from physicians like yourself and others is that it's a book that they can just hand to their patients, and it's, very easy to understand. And so that was the desire, was to make it informative, but also accessible. It's not designed to be, a textbook. It is designed to be an accessible book that people can use to really, learn about this amazing strategy, which has gotten very popular, but is not new or novel.
That's the truth. And where can people find it?
Well, you can go to Amazon, Barnes and Noble, or Target, and or your local bookstore. I always recommend, if you have a local bookstore that still has in-person books, to obviously give them your business. And up until publication, so the date it'll be published is March 15th. There are a bunch of bonuses, things that I think are really fantastic. There's a program called Clean in 14, which is a really great way to kind of rev up your results with IF45, which is the program in the book. We have some bonus recipes. And I forgot to mention that Beth Lipton wrote over 50 recipes that are delicious and easy to put together with no weird ingredients. And then lastly, there's a masterclass with me that will come out on March 10th. So you have to actually purchase the book before March 15th to take advantage of the bonuses, because they will go away on publication date.
Okay. And what's is there a website for the book? I forget to get that ahead of time.
Yeah. So if you go to my website, www.CynthiaThurlow.com, there's a little icon you can click on it. It'll take you directly to the book.
Perfect. Oh my gosh, this is amazing. Now, this is the Root Cause Medicine podcast. So the very last question ever is, I'm all about practical and tactical, just like you are. And what are, other than buy the book, one or two things that you would like to leave listeners with around intermittent fasting and hormones, whether it's things they can do or concepts, things to keep in mind, empowerment things? What are one or two things that you just say all the time?
Number one, you have to get high quality sleep. It's not a sexy topic, but 7-8 hours, high quality sleep. I don't care if you have an Oura Ring or a Whoop or whatever, but you have to really prioritize sleep, because sleep is so profoundly restorative. And if you need help with sleep, there are resources out there. I think a lot of women think it's normal to wake up between 2 and 4 a.m. every single day, not just when they're stressed. I would really encourage people to understand, my kind of standard mantra is, if I can't get you to sleep through the night, I can't get you to lose weight. So sometimes that's the carrot with which I incentivize people to really prioritize their sleep. Much like when our children are babies and we kind of set them up, there are these 5 things that happen that tell their body it's time for them to start gearing down. We have to do the same, whether that's blue blockers, magnesium soaks, whether that's taking things like GABA or L-theanine, listening to music, getting off electronics, really, really important. But sleep is foundational to our health. And without it, you're not going to be able to maximize your results. Number 2, I would say, is probably the need for electrolytes. I have so many people who think I'm kidding when I tell them that they need electrolytes. Well, most of us need electrolytes, period. But you add in fasting, and especially if you're eating lower carbohydrate and you're urinating out most of your sodium and your salt, this can mitigate a lot of very unpleasant side effects if you are new to fasting. And so electrolytes are critically important. There's lots of clean brands that are out there. I've named a couple during the podcast, but to have success with fasting, you have to utilize electrolytes. And that means even salting your food. I know salt has been demonized for years. But I love, high quality sea salt, and I have zero problems salting my food, salting my food vigorously without any issues. And so those are the two things: sleep and salt are probably two big takeaways.
I've really ramped up my electrolyte intake as well. I do electrolytes at some point in the morning, and generally at some point, usually when I work out. So regardless of my exercise, I will do electrolytes to kick off some point in the morning, depending on my fasting, intermittent fasting, and I will do it again in the day as well. And I agree, I have noticed a difference. And I do also, not an ad, but I do also love the element, which is literally the letters LMNT.
Yeah, it's so
We all
clever.
call it element. I also use the Seeking Health, Dr. Ben Lynch's electrolytes as well, and go back and forth. So this has been amazing. Cynthia, thank you so much. I highly encourage everyone to check out her website at CynthiaThurlow.com. Check her out on social media. She's a wealth of information. She's in her stories, and she's given so much information away for free that you will learn a lot simply by following her day to day. But then get the book, buy the book. Like I said, I have the book, and I have already been talking about it with colleagues and other people I know interested in fasting. And I know it will be one heck of a resource for them when it comes out. So thank you.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.